شكرا للأستاذ شوساتو. الآن الكلمة لمديرة المنتج في زينكا في سان فرانسيسكو، وكذلك حائزة على شهادة ماجستير في إدارة الأعمال وخريجة برنامج الشركات الناشئة HPC و MVB. عملت سابقا في فينتر كابيتال في بوسطن على شركاتها الناشئة الخاصة في قطاع المأكولات والمشروبات التكنولوجية، وتعمل الآن كمستشارة استراتيجية في ماكنزي في دبي حيث غطت الشرق الأوسط. الأستاذة ميا فرح مديرة المنتج في زينكا.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? This is working, cool. So my name is Maya Farah, and I'm here to talk to you about gamification and monetization of consumer products. Now, obviously, gamification is something that can be applied to a wide array of topics. One of them being, employee productivity, also to B2Bs. But right now, for the topic of this conversation, I'm going to focus mostly on consumer products. A few words about me. My bio was a little bit upside down in Arabic. I guess I should have translated it. But basically, I'm a computer engineer. I am Lebanese, as you can probably tell from my accent. I've been in the US for 7 years now, have an MBA from Harvard, worked in entrepreneurship and venture capital, and worked for McKinsey in the Middle East before going there, covering most of the countries of the GCC. And I've been in gaming for 5 years now, working for Zynga. At Zynga, I covered Farmville 2, where I was the monetization head. And I was director of product for our poker portfolio, which, by the way, is not real money gaming, so that's okay. So what is gamification? So the most standard definition of gamification is basically taking gaming elements and applying them to non-games. And you do that basically to make your product more engaging. Now, I have a bit of an issue with the term gamification because I think it's been overused and used badly over the years. So for me, what matters here is that there is something to be learned from games, because games are pretty complex, habit-forming products that usually, when they succeed, end up being at scales and end up touching, hundreds of millions of people, if you're lucky, making a lot of money. So there's a lot that has been learned by people working in the gaming industry about how to monetize your consumer base, about how to grow it, how to retain it. And so for me, gamification is really just taking these sets of learnings that the gamers got and applying them when it works to your product. Whether your product is, a dating app, whether it's an e-commerce, anything really in the consumer space can learn from part of these things. Two common misconceptions that you have with gamifications. One is basically because we're describing it as something that you do to boost engagement, people think that it's mostly related to growth. So it's mostly related to customer acquisition, customer retention, engagement, etc. Whereas from my experience in the field, as well as just seeing overall the best practices that go around the industry, I think there's as much to be learned from monetization in the gaming industry as there is to be learned from their growth tactics. Because it's basically products that get, huge user bases, and then learn how to treat each user differently based on whether they're a very engaged person who are going to, spend multiple thousands of dollars a month, or they're a very casual player who will contribute to your success as a game by being there, getting their friends, contributing to the community, or just by, paying maybe like 10 cents here and there. So as a game, you learn how to segment your base and monetize it the way you should. And finally, the second misconception, I think that's the biggest thing that's actually my issue with gamification and the way it was applied, at least in the early days, is that people think that they can take a bad product, gamify it, and turn it into a good product, which is absolutely wrong. What gamification does is it takes your product that works and that has values to the people you're offering to, and it supercharges it. But you can't, apply a leaderboard on top of something that's not working and then expect success out of it. So building on that point, there are a few things that you need to think about before you start thinking about, gamification, monetization, etc. And this applies to the whole spectrum of consumer companies, whether you're a startup and you're trying to figure out how your model is going to work exactly and whether you want to have some habit-forming elements as part of it early on, or whether you're a company that's, you're a Facebook, you're a company that already has a huge base, that has been operating for years, but you think that you're not reaching your potential in terms of user engagement or monetization. So regardless of where you are on this spectrum, before you start, there's a homework that needs to be done. So first of all, obviously, what I just said is make sure that your product works, regardless of all the gamification elements. Make sure that actually what you're offering is scratching an itch is something that consumers want. And that's probably the most important one. Second, now that you know that your product actually works and that people want to be dealing with it and there's an opportunity for you to make it work even better, you need to figure out what are the exact metrics that you're trying to move here. And so obviously, metrics is a pretty generic term. Metrics can be as high level as daily active users, revenue, lifetime value of a customer. But in reality, what I'm asking people to do here is to go, 3 levels deeper. If you think revenue is your problem, like which part of the revenue equation isn't working? Is it, non-payers converting into payers? Is it the amount they're paying? Is it how frequently they are paying? So basically taking a very deep look into your business and figuring out what are the things that you are going to apply, gamification techniques to. And so here, I won't go into too many details, but basically the scientific way to look at it is for each one of your metrics, let's take, conversion, people who are non-payers who are deciding to become payers for the first time. So if this is like the metric that you're focusing on, figuring out what's the delta that you can achieve, either compared to competitors, if you have access to that data, or even if you're a company that's been around for a while compared to your historical data. If your conversion is at 20% and you've never done better than 20.5 or competition is roughly at the same place, then it's probably not the easiest lever for you to pull. So this is one side of the metric, of what needs to be done to determine if you're moving the right metric. The second thing is obviously understanding your business well to see if this is the right leverage for you. To give you an example, number of new installs and ability to gain new customers. Obviously, when you think of it, it's a metric that everyone wants to move. I'm going to take Farmville 2, which was my game for 3-4 years, as an example. So Farmville 2, when we just launched it in 2012, installs were like a huge lever. So obviously, we did everything we could to acquire a lot of people, to put our game in front of a lot of eyeballs. 3 years down the line, Farmville 2 is still making, north of $150 million a year, still pretty big game. But when we were looking at installs, it was no longer the metric that we thought was the most important to look at because we had already installed more than 250 million people. So most likely everyone who was really interested in farming game had given us a try and was already in our database somewhere. And then reactivating new existing players, so people who had installed, tried it, didn't like it, or maybe, dropped off after a while. Getting to these people and reactivating them was actually where the money was. So this is an example where in the same game, the same metric is relevant here, but not relevant 3 years later. And so that's an exercise that's, very, very specific to each product, and that, not gamification consultants, not advisors, but you as owner of the business need to go through. And finally, once you've decided that, X is the metric or the 2 metrics that you want to move, it's really, really important to be able to track the data. Because gamification is not a one-time shot. It's actually, an exercise of iteration and trial and error. So if you decide that you want to move player-to-payer conversion, so if it's an e-commerce, people who come and browse on your site, making sure they pay for the first time, if that's what you're trying to move, then what are the metrics and the data that you will need to see to make sure that this moved the right data, that nothing went wrong. If it didn't work, what are the 3 pieces of data you're going to need to troubleshoot to see what change in behavior that you weren't anticipating happened? So just, data is super important, and it's usually what, gets overlooked a lot. So now that I've given you a little bit of the homework that you need to do before you figure out whether you want to do gamification, etc., I'm going to go through a few examples of things that we learned from our games or from other games that actually would be applicable to other consumer products. So I'm going to start with one growth example, and it's basically quite simple. So we call it the daily drip, and the concept is basically, it doesn't have to be daily, it has to be just frequent enough that it establishes a habit, but it's basically making sure that your users can come back pretty often, ideally daily, because that's the easiest way to establish a habit, and they get a reward for coming in. So, Clash Royale, which was named Best Game of the Year by Apple last week, a great example is basically the free chest mechanism. So while I won't go into all the chests because it's a lot more complicated than that, the free chest is basically every time you log in, most likely if you've waited for a few hours, you have a free chest to collect. You open it, you're not sure what you're going to get, and you get a bunch of cards and coins, etc. Same thing for Zynga Poker. You have a lucky bonus. You don't know how many coins you're going to get, whether it's 3,000, 10 billions. It's a pretty big spectrum. And so what this does is, one, it sets up an appointment for you. You can come back pretty often, and you'll always have something exciting to look forward to. And second, basically, it makes use of a very basic rule of gaming, which is variable rewards. Our human brain is wired to actually get a lot more excited if you don't know what's coming. It's anticipation that does all of the job. It's not the reward itself. So these things, you can't make it work as, come back every day to get $2, because 2 days later, no one will be excited by this anymore because there's no anticipation. So daily drip, very, very simple system that not enough consumer apps and consumer companies make use of. So, on the right are two pretty simple uses of it. So most of the dating apps in the US, at least a lot of them, what they do is they actually claim that they're finding people who are your match, but then they won't give you access to all your matches immediately. They will drip them. So, Hinge is a good example. There's another called Coffee Meets Bagel, where every day, at a certain hour, they will give you access to a certain number of people, and then you sift through them. If you're done the next day, you're going to have a new batch. So this is an example of a daily drip used in a non-gaming situation. Facebook, Instagram, etc., use a lot, the whole concept of variable rewards, because basically every time you log into Facebook and you see your news feed, it is a variable reward system. There's always going to be something that either excites you, you find interesting, you find sad, you don't know what it's going to be, and if you scroll enough, you'll find it. And so adding to this a whole, daily element, so Facebook Memories is a good example of how they were able, based on your past behavior, to use your own actions to reactivate you every single day or every once in a while by telling you, hey, you have memories to look at. Why don't you log into the app and see what they are? And obviously, the genius thing about that is that they're using push notifications to make it look like your past self is just pinging your current self, which has a lot bigger success rate, which actually is quite smart. So I put leaderboards in there, but it's as much a don't do as it is a do. So leaderboards, I think, are in 2011 and before what gave gamification kind of a bad rep, because everyone tried to just slap a leaderboard on top of their app and make it work. And the great example of that is Foursquare. So this is not current Foursquare. This is historic Foursquare, which started as very much of a game and was a great example of a pop and drop. It went really well until it didn't. And so currently it reinvented itself and does much better on a different business model. But the initial one was a great example of how you shouldn't have a leaderboard in a place that doesn't warrant it. So leaderboards are extremely tough. For those of you who work in gaming, you've probably gotten 8 out of 10 leaderboards you've ever designed wrong, because there's a lot of considerations to take. Whether your user base to start with is competitive and cares about these things, and then if they are, who do you make them compete against? Is it local leaderboards or is it global leaderboards? So it's really, really tough. So if you're not a game, it's most likely that you don't need a real leaderboard. But what you can do is like use much softer elements that scratch the same itch as leaderboards do, but aren't exactly just a list of people you're competing against. And one example of that is actually, likes, shares, comments, etc., that you get on a lot of consumer apps these days. And so, obviously, this is something that can be interpreted differently based on your user behavior. So, like for me, for example, I do notice, who has likes, who has comments, who tends to be very viral or not between my friends or between celebrities. I don't, care about it too much. But if you've read, the series of articles that went pretty viral last year about how teens use social networks, you'll see that their way of using Instagram is actually very, very much geared towards, posting once a day, making sure you have the right post, and, having the maximum number of followers, of likes, etc. So these are like soft leaderboard that you can either choose to engage with a little bit, a lot, or not at all. And they're much, much more efficient in terms of, supercharging your consumer product. Now, monetization. So I'm just going to cover two in monetization. One of them, it's super simple. I really, really like it. People don't use it enough as well, is starter packs. And the whole concept behind starter packs is that there's a huge value from getting someone to pay you for the first time. It doesn't matter how much they're paying you. They can be paying you, a few cents. They can be paying you $5. But putting their credit card in for the first time is very, very valuable. It's even more valuable if you're not, on iOS and Android on a platform that's already streamlining all of the, in-app purchases for you, and you actually need them to physically write their credit card number, etc., so that you can save it. So here it's like invaluable. But also, even if you're on an iOS, Android, streamlined platform, just getting them to cross the mental hurdle of, I'm paying this app has a lot of value. And so starter packs is basically taking something and discounting it a lot. Like here, I think this screenshot was like from years ago when we were still, pretty stingy. This is only a 75% discount. But like we've experimented with discounts. You can go up to 95%. It still makes sense. Obviously, the caveat here is that you need to be up, what you're giving away needs to have very low to zero marginal costs, which is easy in gaming because it doesn't cost us anything to give these things. It's not as easy if you're in e-commerce, etc. So you would need to find something that you can give that's not going to break the bank. For example, if you're in e-commerce, you probably want to give them, maybe for like $1, you get access to a private sale or something. So some sort of advantage that's actually not going to cost you a lot of money and backfire. So there aren't actually a lot of people doing that. I was looking for examples in non-gaming consumer products. Even not a lot of the games do it. And the closest thing I could find was actually, these guys who give you a 1-month trial for free, such as Netflix. And so these guys, what they're trying to tell you is, we're giving you a 100% discount on the first month. Why don't you try us? The reality of subscription, though, is that in the consumer's mind, it's not perceived as a 100% discount. It's perceived as I'm stuck with a subscription that I might forget to cancel, etc. So it's not exactly a one-to-one, but it's in the same spirit. And the final thing is watch to earn. So I like watch to earn a lot because it's one of those things that's very win-win for consumers and companies. And what watch to earn is basically telling you, hey, why don't you watch this ad and you will get a benefit from watching this ad. And I, as a company, obviously get paid for you watching this ad as well. But basically what this does is it allows you to monetize the people that were never going to pay you, which is quite incremental. In some businesses where you have a lot of people and not very few of them pay you, it can be up to 90% of your revenue. I'm talking hundreds of millions of dollars, not very small revenue. And in a typical game or consumer product that relies on in-app purchases, it can be up to 10 to 15%, which is quite material. And so this one, obviously, you have to be careful when applying it because offering it to the wrong people, offering too much value in return for watching the ad, popping it too many times. All of these can actually turn something very positive into a negative. So, you need to experiment a lot on it. Rule of thumb is usually like you wait for like at least 2 weeks to make sure that the people weren't going to pay you. And then you offer it mostly to non-payers, maybe a little bit to payers so that they don't get pissed off that they don't have access to the feature. But basically, you need to experiment on this one a lot. You need to A/B test and see what works for you. But when it works, it's actually quite material and very useful. And I think, the one application you've probably definitely seen of it in non-gaming is, in airport Wi-Fi. So when they tell you, why don't you watch this ad so that you can get access to free Wi-Fi, which is usually very positively received on the other end. So win-win is always nice to have. So obviously, like I cited 4 examples, there's hundreds of these things. But just in general, to summarize what we've been saying, if you're gamifying, make sure you're doing it to boost a good product, not to try to, slap lipstick on a pig. You can't fix a bad product with gamification. Make sure the customized solution that you're developing is actually the one that's right for your product. Figure out the metrics that you're trying to move. Have a target ideally for these metrics that you will use to gain success or failure. And finally, be ready to iterate. This is not a one-time solution. It's an exercise in iteration and experimentation. Thank you.